Yes, so as you can see, one of the top threats on the previous slide was, HIPAA compliance. So let's talk a little bit about HIPAA compliance in the cybersecurity era. So we have a few talking points on the screen here. Chuck, if you'd like to give us some insight here. So should cybersecurity and compliance go hand in hand? Does HIPAA provide enough protection in today's environment? Should an organization, rely on HIPAA compliance to cover their security concerns? What are your thoughts on that?
Sure. Certainly an experience that I've had is again going back to that teamwork approach, and one where you start with the basics, and that is understanding and developing certain policies and procedures. And then what's even more critical is the training and education to ensure that staff in your organization know what to do, when to do it. Working with IT in security to ensure that appropriate encryption and tools that are there to sort of stop any leakage before it takes place. But again, I go back to the age-old, your biggest risk in many ways is within the personnel within your organization, and what you then do to ensure that they get it, from online tutorials that we had on a learning management system to those that are scanning the world in terms of regulation to ensure that you stay abreast of what you need to be doing and when to do it. So to think that just by providing and confirming that your HIPAA compliance is in play, that doesn't cover all the security concerns that are out there. And so, it's a piece of the puzzle, but it's not the only piece.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I think I'm exposed to a lot of regulatory work, certainly on this side of the Atlantic, but as a part of that, the regulatory agencies, both in the US and the European Union, there is notes comparisons. Everyone's always referencing whatever publications come from which organization first. And it's interesting, right? HIPAA captures so much of the mind share, but it's been around for a long time. And as a consequence of that, it's not out of the realms of possibility about updates of regulations or interpretations of regulations. You look at how, I often come across the question of where does ransomware come in? When is ransomware a data breach versus when it isn't? And viewpoints, at least between lawyers working around HIPAA, you'd be surprised. You think it's cut and dry, but it really isn't. I suppose that's why we have lawyers. They can argue about these things. But it's It's interesting, interpretations of language. You've seen penalties around involving ransomware. If you start moving outside of HIPAA, you look at FDA guidance, advisory guidance around medical device security in the European Union. You see medical device regulations that are going to be enforced next year. They were delayed because of COVID effectively, which now have an entire chapter on or document on security and clinical risk enmeshed together. You combine that with GDPR on this side, new e-privacy regulations. You look in the US, there's always the viewpoint now with how are different states going to define their regulations further, whether it comes to privacy or potential. I've heard and seen some conversations around defining critical infrastructure and penalties around state level critical infrastructures. There are so many evolving patterns right now that I think, Chuck, exactly as you say, HIPAA is it's one piece on the chessboard, but it's by no means the only piece.
Right.
Yeah, I think you guys hit the nail on the head there. So clearly, HIPAA is not sufficient. It's really a bar that you must establish if you want to be in the business of healthcare. But it's you've got regulations coming from so many different directions, whether it's the state level or the national level, international level, as we have talked about here, that it's not sufficient. What I've seen actually emerge in the last few years, there was a CISO role that came many years ago, and now with this data becoming so important in all industries, specifically in healthcare, this role of a data protection officer that sort of was first, in my mind, outlined in the GDPR on the other side of the Atlantic. So, so I think that finally has the ability for companies to kind of put all the data under the guidance of someone that is accountable and responsible to control that data. And HIPAA sort of is part of that, data protection as well. But I don't see enough progress there to say that we have the mission accomplished, right? We're still sort of developing that here, especially on this side of the pond. I don't know as well how things are. I'd love to hear from Saif more about, how the maturity level you've seen in the last few years. But I think we're still early stages. So I think not having the people, process, and technology in place today really creates a opportunity for the cyber threat to be exposed and ultimately lead into reputational risk. So you've got to start putting together, that people, process, and technology in place. I think, Chuck, you made some really good points about training. I think it starts with having the leadership that understands, what our gaps are in the current knowledge base within the organization about how we treat data, and get beyond that, minimum checklist that you've got to do for HIPAA, because the fact that there are compliance issues and security issues that go beyond the minimal auditable requirements. And that's where the reputational risk comes in, to back to that previous slide of all the different types of risks that healthcare is facing today. So I'd like to hear, the maturity level on what you see on your end, and maybe have Chuck comment a little bit on, in the state he lives in, because they have other protections to the people in that state.
I mean, yeah, Chuck. Go ahead, Chuck.
As Adil was mentioning, the state in which we operate, which is Massachusetts, clearly they keep us busy. And again, from a reputation standpoint, and as well as compliance, you have to do these things. And so making sure that the appropriate people within your organization are having that conversation, and the reality check of what makes sense to what can be done is at issue from time to time because of the mandate itself. But again, it goes back to, for many, what can be done on a day-to-day basis? How do you build it into daily life so it is part of the process, part of the culture of the organization, so that when a new twist comes at you, it isn't we got to start from scratch. It's more, how do we modify? So then we update the training, or do something to address that new need that's come to the eyes of the organization.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting, because from my perspective, at least, in the work we're doing both in the US and particularly recently in the UK, to be precise, it's not just the maturity level at the healthcare organization level or at a regional level. It's also the maturity level we're seeing from the likes of medical device manufacturers and their viewpoints on regulations and their responsibilities. Very recently I was talking to a healthcare security leader I respect tremendously, a real pioneer, and he was saying to me how a medical device manufacturer didn't believe that their assets that they produce complied with certain regulations. And my viewpoint as an expert in that particular field was that, that clearly isn't the case. It does comply. When you have different levels of maturity in terms of your suppliers as well as at the healthcare organization level, then it can be a really difficult web, to unweave, essentially, to figure out, well, what is the right answer? Who does need to comply with what? And if you're not quite mature at the healthcare organization level, but your suppliers have different levels of maturity or different views of what they need to comply with, I mean, that's really challenging. So you need kind of solutions to help you just very directly tell you this is the correct answer, and therefore this is how you should plot a course. Easier said than done, of course.